Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve the agenda?
Yeah.
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
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 All right.
Aye.
All right. Great. All right. So 2.01, board professional development, the board's role in culture development. I think your mic's off.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right. So in alignment with MSIP 6 and also board policy, professional development is to be provided to the board on an ongoing basis. As we wrap up this year, we'll be making adjustments to the Google sheet that's sent out to acquire information from board members in regards to where we want to focus our efforts for next year. But this year, for this session, we will be focusing in on the board role and culture, and I'll give a little preset to that. In addition to revisiting our protocols as we continue to understand how those protocols drive us in the work that we're doing collaboratively. So with all of our professional development and activities that we actually do, I always like to start with the check-in. So the first question that I want to start off with today is, how are you showing up? So if you are showing up as a 1, that means you're crawling. If you're a 2, you're walking. A 3 is jogging. A 4 is running. How are you showing up today? Feel free to unmute, say how you're showing up, give an explanation why.
2.
Trent, why are you in 2?
It's been a long day. I'm walking. I'm not crawling though.
Thanks for sharing.
I would say a 3 for me because it's like countdown for me at work. So I am just like not running fast, but I am running.
I think I was a 2 earlier today, but now I'm a 3 because I'm excited for B to come home. So
I'm also feeling a 3. I was over at the museum opening at the elementary school, so feeling a little rushed with getting some food in kiddos and jumping on this.
I'd say I'm a 2. Just kind of like Trent said, long day at work, getting close to the end of the school year, wrapping things up. So I'd say I'm about a 2.
Well, I'd say I'm a 4. End of school year, lots of moving pieces and trying to make sure that we get all of our graduates across the finish line, as well as closing the loop on the things that we need to do. Any other thoughts about the check-in question? Perfect. All right, so I gave a little bit of homework assignment for the board's role in culture development and sent out an article. We will not discuss the full article, and I'll go through a protocol that we will use as we think about what the board role is in the development of culture. Our outcomes for today's session, pretty simple. Developing relationships, the check-in question, typically I do with the cabinet, also other meetings that we have, whether it's admin council, we always have some form of a check-in or team building activity just to see how we're showing up in the work. And it also gives us insight into how we actually want to move forward, whether or not we need to go faster, slow down based on how participants actually share. The second piece is really understanding the board's role in culture development. I'll talk a little bit more about that once we go through and how we got to this point at this particular time. And then the last piece is to revisit our protocols that were developed as we begin to think about how protocols guide our work in a productive manner, but also ensure that we are following what governance is and how that's outlined for us. So before we jump in, Dr. McGee is going to drop into the chat a link. hopefully everyone will have the ability to access it. I am going to. And so what we have here is a Jamboard. Dr. McGee, I think I the link. All right. And so the first question that I want the board to respond to is around, sorry, I can't get this thing to move. There we go. What is culture? And so just, out of curiosity, so the way that this works, let me reshare my screen. I'm trying to use two screens, and while I am pretty tech savvy, switching in between two is not as easy as it looks. So just really the way that it works is if you go over to the side here and you click a Post-it note, and you can type in culture is the way we do things, or whatever you want to put. And you click save, and it'll drop your Post-it note on. And you can put as many Post-it notes as you want. But really what I plan to do with this information, this is a conversation that we've been having with the central office cabinet team before we transition into the collective bargaining agreement, which we have not officially started, but we're having conversations around district-wide culture. The article that we'll be discussing later has been an article that's been discussed during our teacher leader meetings as we begin to unpack climate, culture, et cetera. So just give you a second to drop in, like, what is culture for you? Thank you. Got our first Post-it note. There is no right or wrong answer. Let me know if you're having difficulty accessing the Jamboard, and I can pivot. Thank you. There's another one. Good one. Like I said, if you're having a difficult time, I can scribe and punch in for you. I do want to give time to get those ideas out. Attitudes that impact employee behavior. Thank you. The shared values of an organization. Fantastic. Keep them coming. Social norms, cultures. Fantastic. Our past and present aligns directly with our strategic plan. The way we talk about our district, the rituals, the customs. So as we wait for other ideas, definitions, thoughts around culture, does anyone want to share what they put, expound upon what they actually added on the Jamboard? Feel free to unmute. You're experiencing your children's experience when they were doing COVID on having to learn using Jamboard and learning virtually.
Well, I think one of the things that I shared was about the rituals and the customs in the district as part of like the promotion for the teacher appreciation night. There was, Ed had asked me for a write-up to share with teachers, and shared that I think one of the special things about the district is those opportunities when large groups of employees are able to get together and to share, you know, just in the same space, and to celebrate and to you know, be authentic. So things like opening day and the teacher appreciation, even graduation, I think are all the mile markers of that in the district.
Other thoughts? Really good with wait time. Right? So these are the definitions that we've been using for the past few years. So if for our new board members, when we give our climate and culture survey data updated, which the first year came from the state, the second year we used a tool that we felt was a little bit more conducive for our district and met our needs in the context better. But want to give you a second to look over the two definitions that we've been using, the one for climate and then the other for school culture. And, you know, the question that I would pose is, what do you see the difference being for the definition that's provided for school culture and then the one that's provided for climate? Then how do these differ or support what you actually added on the JAM board?
I mean, I think one's about expectations and one's about feelings is, you know, kind of how I would sum it up.
Thank you, Josh, for those thoughts. Any other thoughts?
I agree with that. One is more procedural and one is more, you know, I guess I had put that it was the attitudes and the behaviors of individuals on the, you know, in the workplace, but I think, you know, like he said, the culture seems to be more procedural, where climate is more based on, I guess, kind of what I had said, you know, the attitudes and behaviors can potentially impact how other people feel in the workplace.
Any other thoughts? So we'll go back to the JAM board. So the second question that I want us to respond to is, as you think about culture, which can include a lot of things, again, very different from climate, what are those things that you believe as a board member are characteristics of effective culture?
Yeah, put it on the jam board.
Please.
What?
Yes, if you can drop it on the JAM board. I want to go back to this. I'm actually, just to kind of give some context, I'm having the same conversation with the NEA when we meet around what they view as being the characteristics of effective culture. And instead of saying what's the board's role, they will look at it through the lens of what's the role of the teacher. And so I'll do the same activity with our cabinet level staff members too, as we begin to shape that and really use our core values to underpin the conversation around culture. So I do think being very purposeful to be clear that climate and culture are very different, although it's used synonymously. They're two very different things. So if you could drop your ideas on the board.
So I'm still back on the same what is culture with okay, now it just changed.
Clearly define expectations, values, goals, which are explained to all members of the organization. See the word trust, understanding how decisions are made. Collaborations, being collaborative. I heard that today with the group that I was actually speaking with. High expectation for students. Give us a few more minutes to drop in a couple other thoughts. It's collaborative. And you'll see some of these come back up as we go through the presentation and the PowerPoint around like what the Harvard Business Review, as well as a couple other organizations, think are characteristics of effective culture. Shared governance, love it. It's so interesting that I thought I would see other things on here that I hear frequently in the community. So when we go through the list, I'll be interested in hearing some of the dialogue from members of the board around what was shared here on the Jamboard and what actually will show up as we go through. Feel free to keep adding. You don't have to stop adding, but I'll move on just as we go through. So we've been using these two definitions, and for me, the school culture piece, where you begin to talk about patterns of behaviors and attitudes, and then also the piece I want to pull out is the underlying norms and values. And so as we think about values and we think about our district culture, we do have values, and those values are belonging, integrity, inspiration, courage, and success. And so as we think about how we define culture, the role of the core values, and as we think about those core values shaping the patterns or behaviors, that's a critical piece, because I heard someone share that, you know, some of it is procedural, there's an accountability piece, and so we'll unpack some of that as we think about the role of the board. So for the sake of this particular article, you'll see some overlays. So for the article, company culture is everyone's responsibility. The definition that they use to define culture is the ways people in an organization behave and the attitudes and beliefs that inform those behaviors, the way we do things around here. So the formal, the stated norms, the implicit. So when Katie was talking about things like graduation, opening day, believe it or not, a tradition would be the Apple Brigade. All of those things are traditions. So as we talk about how either the removal of those or things that have been around slowly being transitioned, whether it's been, you know, 1 year, 2 year, a result of the pandemic, all of those things combined actually impact culture and other aspects of the organization. So everyone had a homework assignment. I think I shared that sometimes the board gets a little bit of homework. The protocol that we're using to discuss the article is actually a very light protocol. It helps to guide the conversation. So the pre-work for this particular segment of our time together asks that each board member identify either one significant idea or quote, or I like to say a pithy thought, and then also to have a backup quote or thought in the event that a colleague actually selected something that you had. And so everyone should have already done that. If not, you do have time as I go through the rest of the protocol before we get started. So that part should already be completed. And then a brave soul will go first and share their thought and explain why they picked that particular thought quote with the collective group. And then after that, the person who shared no longer can say anything. Each board member then has a minute to actually respond to either say they agree, they disagree, they can ask a question. But again, the person who shared is unable to actually respond. And then once all of the board members have responded in a variety of ways to the thought that was shared, the person who initially shared would have what's called the final word to react to the things that were heard. And then we'll continue the protocol until all of the board members have had an opportunity to share their thoughts. Are there any questions about what we're doing? All right. Is there a brave soul who would like to go first?
I will.
Thank you, Christy.
Yeah, so I'm going to read it here because so that way I can kind of follow. But I think one that stuck out to me was changes to the culture must be explicitly communicated and vetted by all. And I say that because I think sometimes I mean, we all know that it's very important to have stakeholder buy-in. That's obviously paramount. And so I think that when an organization makes changes to or tries to make changes in the culture or the way things are done in a building or in a district or any workplace, I think it's important to like express why. I think it's important to get others' feedback and to see like like I had said before with the collaborative piece. I think that's really important. So that way, people are going to respond better to things that they have input into, and then also that they have a vested interest in. So I think that's like really important.
Thank you. Anyone want to respond to Christy's quote or piece that she pulled out of the article? And then we can just continue to go until everyone is shared, and then she can give the final word.
I'll go because that was one of my quotes I had selected, Christy. So I also think that one of the most important parts about establishing a workplace culture is making sure that people understand what their expectations are and then that they're clearly, followed by all members. So I think that was a great quote to pick because I also had that one too. So now I have to find another one.
Thank you, Jenny. Anyone else? Reactions to these quotes?
I think that's a good one as well. I think my internet is unstable. Apologies if I am choppy. But it has me wondering about, since this article is about a variety of people's roles, how communication is shared across a variety of roles related to communicating about culture and decisions.
That one's going to come back up again. Thank you, Katie, for lifting that out. We can deviate from the protocol, but typically everyone has to respond before I hand it back over to Christy.
I'll go next. So I don't have a particular quote, but rather an observation that this article doesn't really address, which is that I think a lot of culture is about reinforcing behaviors or reinforcing culture that already exists, that you don't need to recreate or impose some sort of culture on an organization. Often there already is an established culture that's working, and then mirroring and reinforcing that culture is kind of the way to go. And then culture will kind of develop on its own.
I think that's kind of interesting because I just kind of took the opposite. Well, I would say the opposite approach. I do think that consistency is a very important part of it. But I also think that you can't be afraid to look at what's working and what's not working. And I don't mean to jump ahead, but it seemed to be that one of the important aspects of it was to make sure that culture is constantly being evaluated and constantly being addressed. So while consistency is important, it's also important to recognize how it can be improved.
That.
Yeah, well, my internet's kind of acting up just like Katie. So if I seem choppy or go out, that's why. One thing, I agree with everybody said, but one thing kind of stuck with me was, culture is the glue that binds the organization together. So as I was reading the article, as was going on, the part where they talked about the data breach, and the one thing stuck out to me is, are we safe? So if everyone don't understand the culture or not coming on board to understand what the organization is trying to do, and everybody's going their own way and having their own thoughts of what culture should be, there could be some risk. It could be some things that can go left field on us. So until everyone really understands the culture, the mission of what an organization is doing, is everyone really safe? Because you're not on the same page.
Linda?
I would, wanted to add something here too. My problem is, I think I came into the conversation like as a 3 with your chart earlier, but my internet is a 1. So I seem to be having serious lags here. So hopefully everyone can hear me. My quote, I had about, 3 I found helpful, but on page 2, the bottom of page 2 says that many organizations, there's a gap between the existing culture and the quote desired culture, the culture needed to support and advance the company's goals and strategies. And related to it, a couple pages later, it talks about the role of the board as quote, ensuring that it aligns with business goals and meets the needs of all stakeholders. Those stood out to me as potentially sensing a shift in the culture of the district over the last few years, and whether that shift is desired or undesired, and the extent to which the board needs to shape a move towards a desired culture and have a more hands-on role there, or what exactly is the culture that we're moving towards from where we came. So thank you.
And I'm sorry. Oh wait, I can only talk once.
All right. Has everyone had an opportunity to share? Trent, did I have your voice in the room?
I thought you did, but I may have been muted. So I said that I feel like a lot of culture is really about reinforcement, and that you don't really have to recreate culture necessarily unless things are not working. So if you have a culture that's already working, trying to figure out how that works, bringing people into that culture, and reinforcing the good things about it. If there are problems, then fix those problems. But I don't really see any sort of imposition. I didn't really feel like that was in the article, that really we're talking about refining existing cultures that already exist. It's very unusual that you would just start a new culture from scratch.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share their quote? I'm sorry, no, Christy, you get the final word. I always forget about that part. So based on what you heard everyone say, any thoughts that you want to add before we move on to someone else?
No, I appreciate it. I didn't think about, one of the things that come up was logistically how to get everybody's input based on their role. Like I said, I think ultimately to get everybody on the same page, you really have to get their buy-in and their feedback. And I did hear that from other people, just kind of seeing what it is that the employees and the people want and kind of building from there.
Perfect. Do I have another brave soul who would like to share their burning quote?
I mean,
all right, I'll do it. Oh, did you want to go? Someone else?
I could. I mean, you ladies first, please.
So a lot of mine have been talked about now, because I think my second one was something maybe Trent or actually Brian highlighted, but I guess I would like to use maybe my time to talk about the board's role, and it's, specific. It's guiding the definition and development of the desired culture, ensuring it aligns with business goals and meets the needs of the stakeholder. And I guess I have more of a question that hopefully those of you who've been there can use your 1 minute to sort of tell me, like, how have we done that? Has the board established the culture or defined it in a way? Because I guess I like reading this article, but I also want to not just talk about it, in theory. Like, it would be nice to apply it to our organization. So how are we doing that? How do we do that? How do we evaluate it? And then I think, to go to what Katie said earlier, then how does that messaging, how does it all work, I guess? So that's sort of, I'll start that conversation.
Okay. Well, if I could jump in, there have been a couple of ways that we've been trying to adopt or modify a culture. The first way is we actually created some norms that was done during the, I guess, last, I don't know, term or whatever you want to call it, of the board. So some of the norms that you're reading actually were created by us on how we want to function. Another way that we sort of create culture, there were a couple of resolutions about how we want to be seen, what we value in our schools as far as openness and acceptance and all those things. And I think that what we've been trying to do is here's the problem with the term stakeholders when it applies to school boards, because if you look at stakeholders as like investors or shareholders or whatever, so you've got the community, but the people that we most clearly answer to are the kids. And so those are the people that we really should focus most of our attention on. Like all of our decisions really should be centered around, okay, what's going to be best for the kids and their learning and development and things like that. And so if we consistently ask that question as we perform our duties, that's another way that we're trying to enforce culture, that it is kid-centric, learning-centric. Those are the things that we value.
I want to kind of second that. I agree with Josh. I guess because I work in a school setting as well, stakeholder to me is more holistic, I guess, when, approach. So for me, stakeholder, I think, like they say, it takes a village to raise a child. And so I think that when I think of stakeholder, I think of everybody that essentially touches that child's life. And so that could be anything from the teacher to the parent to another community member that, watches them in the after school program, whatever that might be, because that's, who makes up the child's world essentially. And so I think for me, when I think of stakeholder and when I refer to stakeholder, that's kind of what I guess I'm talking about.
I think other ways that the board has been active in establishing and helping to reinforce culture, goes all the way back to things like the metaphors and, some of the kind of catchphrases of the district, safe and inspirational spaces, things like that. And so I was, specifically thinking about the approval of the strategic plan that was poured into by dozens and dozens of stakeholders, whether it was students or teachers or parents, over the last, many months. And then, I think the refinement of having both a mission and a vision, along with values that were also collectively defined. And, even in one of my board committees most recently, there was a parent who was like, I don't really like this value as much as that value, but, I see how it fits into the, to the bigger picture. So, I think there are shades of how, into the culture folks may be, but, that recognition that it's defined for everyone has more specificity, I think, in the last few years.
Yeah, I would say one thing with the board, we all have learned to respect one another. We might disagree, but we still show respect and value one another's opinion, and only show that respect to others in the community, whether it be a student, teacher, parent, stakeholder. Our goal is to show kindness and respect to everyone, wherever we're at, because we are representing the school district. and to keep the reputation we have, because we have an awesome school district. So as we're holding up to our mission statement, we really honor that as board members, you know. So the one thing that we all have learned is that, yeah, we're going to disagree, but at the end, we're going to respect one another, and we're going to come to a compromise to make the best decision for our students, our teachers, and our district.
Jenny, I'll just add, as Linda wraps up, that part of that is administering the climate and culture survey twice a year. So even though the state requires that it only be done once, we do actually administer it. And I think that data and that information, if you look at the strategic plan, there are some specific goals. And as we go through the rest of the conversation around what are we doing? Now, I will say that your question is actually a great question, because when I had the same conversation with our cabinet, we discussed, like, how do we define what culture is so that it can be communicated? And so that's why I'm actually bringing it here, because I thought this article really designated for me as a superintendent that the board has a role, the superintendent has a role, the cabinet has a role, teachers have to, like, everyone in the organization, and they should be able to not only identify what it is, but be clear about how do we hold each other accountable when someone is showing up in the space and not following those. So this is the first attempt to actually codify it. You hear me use that word a lot, but I felt it was critical to begin the conversation with the board, because at the governance level and the role of the board, there needs to be some voice in that. And we'll revisit this as we go through for that. So I just wanted to add that additional piece or layer. Other thoughts about Jenny's statement? Perfect. Jenny, do you want to have a final thought? Because you do have the final word, since that's the quote or thought that you shared.
Yeah, I guess that what I heard, like, for me, it's a little overwhelming, like the number of things that sort of go into it. So I think it would be helpful for us, as you know, we participate in our role in defining culture, to be real clear about it. And it is something that's going to take time. But I would also challenge us to also ask, is how we defined it working, right? Like, we should be constantly asking ourselves that, because you know, I get a feeling sometimes maybe it's not. So, like, let's take a step back and reevaluate which particular piece is working or not. It seems like that's part of our ongoing role too, what I got from this article.
I appreciate that. I'm actually taking notes. So if you see me nodding or giving you some sparkles, just going back, because oftentimes, to your point, Jenny, you'll hear someone say something and they'll say that it's culture, but in all actuality, it is really the climate. And really having those conversations so that we can talk about that. And the example that I gave a group of teachers that I was talking to was the start and end time for the ECC, right? And what went into that, the why behind that. And so I said, it's okay if you don't like the decision, right? You know, your point of view in regards to the decision that was made. The culture piece is, during that decision, as we made it, were you valued? Were you mishandled? Did you understand, like, were there things there that you weren't mishandled along the way? And that's the way that I've been kind of talking to them about it, because I had someone to say, well, the culture is bad. Our building hasn't been painted. And so over time, as we think about the rituals and the things like that, through a conversation that I had today, it was like, it's a combination of things. So I do think as we continue to go through and refine and have those conversations to say, is it working? So what I'm planning to do is take all of the information and the notes that I'm receiving from the board, the notes and information that I receive from the members of the cabinet, and then also the conversation that I have with the execs of the NEA to say, now let's unpack this and talk about how will we collectively define it, and then eventually get to that point and then talk about what those characteristics are. So thank you for that. I do have time for one more if someone wants to share their quote.
Well, I think that I would like to, if nobody else wants to, but I'll give other people if they want to, I'd certainly defer to them. No? Okay, so my quote was, the company's culture needs to be adaptable. And I think that this kind of goes back a little bit to what Jenny was saying, that, it is something at our meetings we do need to evaluate. Is this working for us? Particularly as I kind of envision the board moving forward, I would like it to be a little bit more collaborative about how we present information to the community. And I'd like us to think about ways that we could answer questions with more detail, but not necessarily with longer explanations, if that makes sense. Like how we can sort of pare down jargon and how we can sort of get to the meat of things that, in a digestible way that everybody can kind of understand. Oh, we're having this decision, but now I understand why we're making this decision. So instead of it's just we're doing something, it's why we're doing something, just that little extra bit. I think that that's important, because I think that what the board does here a lot is, oh, we just don't know anything, or, there isn't a lot of information, or whatever it is. And it's not enough to just say, well, look here. I think it is more of a responsibility of us to, when we do present things, to do our best to give a succinct sort of summation of why we're doing something.
Thank you, Josh. Anyone want to share their thoughts in regards to Josh's quote or comment from the article?
I'm going to piggyback off what he said. I 100% agree with that. I think that it is important to collaborate with the community, and I think it helps with transparency, but I also think it helps everybody feel more invested. And so I 100% agree with them.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with both of you. I think the more information we can provide in an easy to understand way leads to a lot less confusion, a lot more, people wanting to participate because it's easy to participate. And so I agree with that 100%.
Other thoughts? Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts. So I'll move on. So one of the questions that I had you to add on the Jamboard was characteristics of effective culture, right? And so some of the responses that I saw, for example, I saw someone put collaborative. The piece that I didn't see, which was so surprising from all 7 board members, no one put communication on, but it came up in a variety of different ways. So Josh talked about communicating the why behind the message and being succinct in that explanation. And then Christy added to that by saying that by doing that, we're allowing the community to be invested. And Jenny echoed that too and talked about the accessibility of information, pushing our community to be involved. But the thing that underpins all of what we're talking about when we talk about culture, the main characteristic that was highlighted in this article published in 2024 was around core values, and how core values really underpin the work and serve as the guiding principles of the work that we do. And so you will often hear me say our core values are belonging, integrity, inspiration, courage, and success, not just for students, but that also applies for adults. What does that look like, and how do we begin to unpack that? And then we talked about collaborative culture and how people work together. And I think as we enter into our agreement of the collective bargaining agreement and thinking previous structures that we've had, how do we continue to ensure that members of our community, whether it's on the strategic planning committee or whether it's on a curriculum writing committee or some other form of committee, that they are having an opportunity to collaborate, including being able to collaborate as teachers through professional learning communities. The communication piece is there. The next two, which I thought were interesting, one of the board members, I didn't know because it's anonymous, but talked about a focus on student focus and focus on student achievement or something like that. That falls under that unified purpose and so in long-term goals. And so as we think about our strategic plan, how are our goals within our strategic plans and the actions that we've outlined for those priority areas supporting the work, and then how do we overlay our core values in that? So if we say that all students should belong, then that means we have programming that supports that all students belong. And then that also aligns with policy when we talk about the role of the board. Do we have the right policies to support that? The other piece is sense of community. This one is the one that, quite honestly, I struggle with and how I'm trying to continue to build a community. So this one is not about sense of community as we talk about a unified purpose, thinking about family, but it's how are we engaging our community, interacting to ensure that it's not siloed, isolated, or fragmented. Right. And so that's something that I'm continuing to try to unpack. And then the last one is self-explanatory recognition, which Katie talked about from a tradition standpoint. And I will tell you that that is a big piece. I had a meeting with a few teachers this afternoon or this evening. And one of the things we talked about is understanding what recognition looks like for each individual person and just sharing. The central office admin team actually did a book study on the 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace. And what was interesting, it was a result of some feedback that I got on my 360 survey. And one of my staff members said that they didn't feel valued. And for me, it was important. It didn't matter if it was one. I needed to figure out why it was. And what I found is that how I was showing appreciation was not what that person needed. So I had to make the shift from that book study. But I think that's a piece of it. And then the last two, which you have heard frequently, is how are we using professional development as a means to support our culture? And you've heard a little bit about that. So not only being able to lead for professional development, but internal professional development opportunities to build capacity. And then the last piece is an iterative process. So as we sit, whether it's, me sitting with teachers or sitting in post checks, how am I taking that information in? How am I sharing that information with the central office cabinet team? How are we adapting it so that we're making changes to continue to improve culture? So I'm going to give this a second here to sit. What questions or thoughts do you have as it relates to the characteristics of effective culture as outlined here for you?
So all those characteristics. Okay, so I'm sorry, I didn't see we switched a page. All right. Is this somewhere on that everyone can access, like staff, teachers, administrators, because this is a lot, and you'll have to forgive me because I have not worked in a large organization in a long time. I work by myself. So a lot of this is not sort of ingrained in my daily work life. But when we are talking about, we have a mission statement and a vision, but then you talked about those 5 core values. Is it safe to say that that's really like what our culture is based on? Are those sort of 5 characteristics?
So the core values are actually one of the characteristics, and they use framework.
Okay.
I use to answer your first question, Jenny. So as I was thinking about how I wanted to engage the board, I'm a learner, so I went through and was like, how do we define? And so I a bunch of articles from Harvard Business Review, et cetera. And this one really resonated because it aligned with the work and some of the things that I've been hearing in my listening and learning. So, we've heard repeatedly about opportunities for communication. The core value one is there, but what's interesting is that our core values, when you kind of list them out, you can connect them to any of these. If we're saying that a core value for the district is success, then our learning and development, both for students and staff, should dictate that. So how are we providing students learning opportunities to ensure they grow? And how are we providing learning opportunities and development for staff to ensure that they grow? So these are just sharing, but the hope is for us to begin to unpack this further as we move through.
And I guess that's what's helpful for me is sort of you're always going back to like how you achieve those core values through, you know, connection, collaboration, learning. You know, I guess that's more helpful to me to sort of understand. Because it's I'll be honest, a little
Jenny,
over.
yeah, Jenny, I think the way I kind of see it is that these are like the tools for culture, and they're kind of agnostic about, you know, what the principles, the values are. So we've articulated what those principles and values are, and so then we need to deploy these tools in a way that reinforces that, right? I mean, you could have a value of a culture that is you know something that's negative, right? And then you would deploy communication in a way to, you know, reinforce a negative thing, right? I mean, nobody's gonna select that for culture, but it could, you know, again, as I see it, these characteristics are tools, and we have to deploy them to achieve.
Some better than others. I'll own that. We're still working on some. We are an organization of continuous improvement, but I appreciate the thought around that, Jenny, because the goal is really, and I'll make sure that when I add or have Kat to add the presentation, because I didn't want anybody sneak peeking, that I will link the article that talks and goes in depth around these varying characteristics. And then as we continue to engage in conversation, we can talk about how our core values show up in some of these and what that looks like. And I think it goes back to something that I heard a board member say about communicating the why, but then it also includes communicating both vertically and horizontally within the organization information. Other thoughts before we go on to the last section of our time tonight?
I just wanted to notice that, you know, I often hear you taking a lot of responsibility, Dr. Jameson, for this. You know, like I think just a few minutes ago, you know, you said like, you know, I am incorporating this into my pulse checks and my, you know, my conversations, and just, you know, want to continue to point us back to the, you know, the thesis of this piece that we read, that is like, you can't be the only one at many levels, right? Who is deploying these tools in a way that supports the values that have been agreed to by a large number of stakeholders. And so just wanting to notice that and, you know, acknowledge that you have a lot of ability for this, and you are not the only responsibility holder.
Thank you for that. Other thoughts before we move on? All right, hearing none. Mr. President, may I move forward with our next session?
Please, 2.02, this is more professional development, MRH board norms and protocols.
So this is the fun part. I'll let you know that I think I sent the wrong message to Josh and he thought we were doing role plays. And I said, oops, it's scenarios. So it's fun. These are all made up. And
Well, let's be honest. What I said was, hold up, do we have to do role plays? Because I really didn't want to.
I was not going to say that.
All right.
So we'll have 3 scenarios. We're focusing on 3 areas. from the scenario. So not that I want to read to you, but I will read this item and then we'll unpack it and then we'll go through how this attaches to the board protocols and have some additional conversation. So Susan, the board secretary, had a conversation with the parent while at the Blue Duck. During the conversation, the parent shared that she had concerns with the new program that the district is implementing and believes the collective board should discuss it. Susan sends an email to the superintendent requesting that the item be placed on the next board agenda. The item was presented previously at the January board meeting. Understanding our board protocols, how should this scenario be addressed?
Well, if the president doesn't feel that it should be on there, then he would put it off. He would say, okay, we're not going to do this. But if the board member then still feels that it should be on this scenario, then he should call for a vote. He or she should call for a vote to decide whether or not it's on there.
Perfect. Any other additions to that? Anybody add anything, take anything away?
I assume it's the case that Susan, the board secretary, also notifies the parent of the link to the January board meeting and maybe the documents associated with it, and invites the parent to consider whether there's already been enough information or whether they still have further questions they would like the board to address. I would hope that's the first move. And then the second move is to add it to the agenda.
So any other thoughts before I share the next slide on anything that you've heard? So I've heard the president review, if there's disagreement, there's a vote of the full board. I've heard the board members send the link to the board meeting to the parent and then add the item to the board agenda. Any other thoughts about this scenario? There's no right or wrong answer. It's all in fun. All right. So hearing none, I'm going to flip over to what our actual items are. So Brian, you mentioned, I'm going to go back to the item that you mentioned. So there's a perpetual calendar that exists and it's completed annually. And then that perpetual calendar is reviewed. We're currently in the process of reviewing it to take to the board president and vice president to review. It would eventually come back to the board as a means to look at which of those items can be placed in consent or which of those items don't need to be on the perpetual calendar. And typically those things are items we have to present as a result of M6 or as a result of federal or state law. But this details what should happen. So typically the board member or individual would bring that to the president, vice president, and then have a discussion with the superintendent. If it's an item that's already been presented, typically those items do not come back. And then if there's disagreement, as Josh stated, there could be a vote by the full collective board to add the item onto the agenda. Now, I do want to point out that last year we did some surveys to get feedback from community, and community can actually follow the process using board policy BDDH to add, ask the board to add items to the agenda too. In addition, Brian, I just want to kind of lift out, this is not the protocol that we're discussing, but there is a protocol in regards to how individual board members are to communicate with community members and then who needs to be included on that communication as well. So I think one is like speaking as a collective. I think it's speaking, the protocol is speaking as the one voice as a whole, and then the other around communicating with constituents. So I'm going to pause and kind of open it up for conversation from the full collective board.
So I had some general questions just about the protocols. Is it okay to ask those now, or do you want me to wait till the end?
No, we can do them right after each scenario if you want to wait to the end. It's really, the board's conversation as I revisit these and ensure that we're following the protocols that have been developed.
Okay, so I guess that was my first question. Before these were approved last fall, did we have norms and protocols that these replaced, or this is a whole new thing?
We did not have norms
Okay.
and so it's the iteration for leveling up and putting some protocols in place so that we can continue to refine governance, which we've had turnover in the board with the new board members. So be evaluating themselves soon on governance and how you're doing at the governance level. But this is a result of that.
Okay,
Yeah,
and
and
so
I
then-
mean, I
oh,
would
sorry,
just
go ahead.
add to say, we had protocols, they just weren't written and kind
Yeah.
of like collectively agreed to. So, I mean, again, I think as Dr. Jameson said, this is part of the leveling up, getting things to be just not like folklore, but actually like, in writing.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's why I just wanted to make sure I understood that. And then I guess the second thing is this seems like, since like basically these were decided by a group of people, many of which are not here anymore. You have new people. And I guess I would suggest, I think this is a good meeting every year, maybe to revisit these, to discuss them, to see if there are any, thoughts by new board members about them, because, like you're beholden to a set of norms established by a different group. And so I appreciate that we're talking about these now that we have new people. I guess with this particular item of the policies, I noticed that it says if other board members are requesting additional items, that they send it to the president. And I guess I would just say in general, the policy says the vice president, and this has nothing to do with me personally, just in general, if they are also discussing agenda setting, that perhaps both those people should be copied so that then they're both in the know when they go to discuss agenda setting. If that makes sense to people.
Yeah, I have a related question as Jenny's. The board policies, what supersedes what here? Because the norms and protocols seem to me to be kind of maybe general interpretations of the board policies, or maybe highlights of the board policies. Is that how to read them?
The
only reason I ask is on this example is that Jenny's raising, the language of bullet point number 2 here doesn't quite match the policy. So what's the authoritative text? Is it the agenda? Is it the board policy, or is it the norms and protocols?
So the norms and the policy is there, and that's what we're following. The protocols are a way for us to interact as a team of 8. So this is what the board worked on over multiple sessions. So it's not to say one or the other, but a way that we ensure that everyone is following the same steps. I guess the question is, and I would ask if it's okay, this item, Jenny, to your question, will be coming back and was actually one of the things we would be talking about during a work session. So I would ask if we can maybe filter those questions so that can come through the work session when we do collectively look at it to see if adjustments can be made. The purpose of this particular portion of the work session is to ensure that we are following the protocols that have been outlined and not necessarily.
When will we do that?
Yeah,
I guess.
Oh, sorry.
So the board retreat will be rescheduled. So, and I can talk offline about that.
Okay. But I think typically, yeah. Okay. So that was supposed to take place right after we were brought on board. So that seems like good timing. So that's perfect. Is that generally when it would be going forward, is sort of that in that first month or so after you have an election?
Yes, and we actually with onboarding, and then also we have 2 retreats twice a year, which I think Kat has probably already started kind of nailing down those dates, and they typically are on Saturdays. Brian, feel free to unmute. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. There's so much internet lag. I'm sorry if I talked over somebody. If there was a moment of quiet and then I started talking, anyway, yeah, but so you had said just a moment ago, and that we need to follow the norms that are listed here. And again, I just want to say where the norms conflict with the policies, which is the authoritative text.
So the policy guides the work that we do. These aren't norms. So if you go to the norms and protocol document, the board actually developed norms which are included at the onset. So that what we're looking at right now are what we're calling as protocols. So the norms, I didn't my document with me.
Right. So is it, if the protocols differ from the board policy, is the board policy the authoritative text and the protocols need to be adjusted to match? That's all my question is.
Yes, the policy is what we follow.
Okay, thank you.
The agreed upon protocols that the then board created, and we will revisit these throughout. So again, the purpose of this particular activity is to ensure that we're actually following these. In this particular case, individual board member, if we're saying that the board, a board member cannot speak for the full board. So in the example that you gave where you said you would send the link, that wouldn't necessarily be the approach that would be taken. But I think outlining that, what's the process to add an agenda item based on what's been developed. But we will revisit them as a collective board. So thank you for those questions. Other questions about placing items on the agenda?
All right, one more, just this is process. So if the president denied the request, then the procedure would be at the board meeting, you know, before you approve the agenda, it would be, you would make a motion to amend it and then we would vote on it. Is that accurate to say that's how that would
No.
Okay.
I think that the way it works is that you would vote on whether or not to be brought back at a future meeting. And the whole reason about putting something on the agenda ahead of time is so that everybody has enough time to actually answer something about it. So, like, let's say you wanted to have some specific information about, I don't know, one particular program that we had to fund or something like that. You couldn't just add that on the day of, because nobody would be able to answer questions on that program in an effective manner. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's fair. So where in the meeting would be the appropriate place? Is that just in the board
I think
communication
that
section?
probably the appropriate time to do it would be you know, before we begin action. Like it might be I think that it happened last meeting, like right at the very beginning, where Brian had added something or changed something, or he wanted to change something. So I think that that's probably the appropriate time before we kind of get down into formal business, is to you know, say, hey, let's I'd like to bring a motion to do X, and then, you know, we'll do it then. I mean, if we can all agree to that, I don't think it. I think we can kind of do what we want, but I think that makes
Yeah, I
sense.
mean, and that's what I'm saying. It's like, you know, like if we have something like it's helpful to know like what the actual process is to use it. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that unless other people disagree, I think that at the very beginning would probably be the best time to do it. I mean, I think I've talked about this before, and we're going to have to talk about it more, but I think that the way we have the meetings needs to be tweaked a little bit. So,
and I will say in my other experience, generally a good time to raise things like that too is like if we have, you know, I know there's a board updates, but it's also sort of a board communication point. So that might also be something to consider as we're tweaking. But thank you, Josh.
yeah. You had a question, Brian?
Yeah, again, if I look at the board policy on agendas, it says something different than this, slightly different. Items can be added at the meeting itself if it's in accordance with law. That's one thing the board policy says. And the other thing the board policy says is if a member of the board requests an item to go on the agenda, it says it will be added to the tentative agenda unless, I'm just reading the text here now, unless the board recently discussed the same issue, the board president decides they should be reserved for a future meeting, or the member agrees otherwise. So the question then becomes, how recent is recent? And that would be, I guess, a protocol issue. And then the board president decides it should be reserved for a future meeting. Again, but what's not available is an option to not put it on the agenda at all. It's just a matter of which meeting it goes on. That's what the board policy would say. So the protocol seems to conflict with the policy. That's all my point is, and I'm trying to get a sense of what's the authoritative text.
Oh, I see. I think I see what the problem is. Okay, so ideally what would happen is before we had the meeting, either before the agenda was set or shortly after the agenda was set, let's say, well, actually, okay, so ideally what would happen is before the agenda is set, someone would come forward and say, hey, I'd like to have this on the meeting. And then there would be a discussion about, oh, wait, we talked about it on whatever date. It, does that answer the question, or is there something else specific about that needs to be brought up? And if there's enough time, then ideally, we would see whether or not it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, like let's say, hey, I think it's better for a future meeting, or maybe they don't have enough time to like research the issue. That's when the board president, I think, would say, okay, you know what, I'm not going to put this on this agenda, but if the board member was like, no, I really want this there, I think that what would happen then is that you put it on, like you have a vote, and it is put on for a future meeting. That was my understanding.
That was mine too. I would say, Brian, because I also have to be mindful of the members of cabinet, you can put an item on at a meeting, but it's not going to be productive. And so if they don't know what the information is. So Jenny, if you don't mind me using an example, during the vice president and president meeting on Friday, we talked about some items, and there was a request for a particular date for it to be added, and we unpacked that collaboratively together and landed on a spot. So that's typically how it works. I have not, and I'm in my third year, had at this point, even looking at board policy, to have a board member to say, I want to add this right now. I would say, being in this role and being in education for quite a long time, that wouldn't give community nor the board members enough time to get the information that it would be needed, particularly if it's from administration. So we can revisit the norms and also the protocols when we come back, but I do want to make sure that we get to the other scenarios as well. Brian, you have another question?
Oh, yeah, sorry, it's just you cut out a good bit there when you were talking. I'm sorry, you just
I can
repeat it. It's possible that everybody had it messed up there.
Sure, no problem. I was saying that there has been a situation where there has been a request for items to be added. And through the conversation, which Josh was talking about, setting the agenda with the president and vice president, we had a discussion and identified a mutual agreeable date to put that item on. So that has worked fairly well in the process. I have not yet in my tenure had during a meeting a vote or asked for a vote for an item to be added, because someone on the cabinet would need to present that item. So it would basically be the board members talking, and if the cabinet does not have great information to share, the responses that the board would get would be, that's a great question. Might we bring that back at another meeting? So it's a way for us, as we talk about governance and placing items on the agenda, for us to collaboratively do that to ensure that everyone is prepared. But we will revisit this. But to your question, policy does supersede the protocols. The protocols was something we worked through as a means to ensure that everyone was moving and working in the right direction, but they will be revisited as we have 3 new board members. So hopefully that answers your question. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Scenario number 2. Let's try to get through these. I do want to be mindful. During a board meeting, several board members asked questions for clarification regarding several agenda items. The next day, 2 board members sent emails requests directly to the superintendent with a request for information unrelated to the board agenda items. An additional request for information was sent to the board secretary requesting information. Collectively, the superintendent received 38 questions, some of which were duplicates. Using the board's protocols, how should this scenario be addressed?
Well, I'm not actually looking at the protocol document. I know I could pull it up, but I think that to, avoid the potential of having a unposted meeting, we're actually supposed to be sharing questions individually to the president and potentially, to Jenny's point earlier, to the vice president as well. So that the president can be a filter for some of those things, because they are in more frequent communication with the superintendent, potentially, than other board members are. So first thought.
Thank you, Katie, for that. Other thoughts?
I think that a lot depends on what the questions are about. I mean, if they're questions of information, then I think they can be dispatched rather quickly to the people who want the information. If it's a question about something that requires a decision, then I think you probably are going to have to present that information at the next board meeting, because otherwise you'd be deliberating online.
For that.
Well, I think also too, one of the things to add there, and just kind of gleaming from the request for information portion of it, it is important to realize that the amount of questions you ask, or the frequency of questions you ask, while yes, the information may be available, the cost benefit of using resources to gather that information may not be feasible. So there's a couple of ways that the superintendent could go about it. One, she could bring the matter before the entire board to see whether or not this is something that collectively they think would be a good use of resources. The other thing that could happen is the president could say, you know what, no, this is just taking up too many resources or time, so we can answer some of them. But I think the important thing about this also is that none of this should be happening in a vacuum. So if there is a concern about the number of questions, or the types of questions, you should, one, make sure there should be communication between the superintendent and those asking them, maybe with the president or vice president also involved, just to make sure we understand, one, what we're asking for. Two, okay, well, I've got a number of questions that might be duplicative or whatever. Would it be okay if we just answered this group of questions? Additionally, it's important to understand, kind of why the questions are being asked, because ultimately, presumably it's to help move some project or some agenda item, that could be presented at a meeting. And sometimes it's important for the person that is having the question posed to them to understand why it's happening, because that can help them better answer the question. I'm sorry, I see your hand up, Brian.
Oh, no, continue. Go ahead. I can wait.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm done.
Yeah, I was simply going to say, with this policy of being able of emailing just the president and the superintendent and the vice president, the other board members aren't going to know who's asking what questions. So you're going to have overlapping questions. That's just the nature of how this is going to run. So presumably the president, the vice president, the superintendent can figure out which questions are the ones that need to be answered in which order. And I assume everybody, you know, if you get 50 questions, you get 50 questions, but you can quickly sort out an order, a hierarchy of the questions. And the other thing I would say, and this would be a protocol item, and it's not written in the protocols, but this would be something I would recommend being added if we get to that, is just like board members can submit items for an agenda 5 business days in advance. I think questions should also go, you know, 5 days in advance. You can't be sending questions in a day or two before the meeting and expect an answer. I've certainly sent questions in at any time, but that's just because I'm getting up to speed quickly here. But I don't expect an answer, you know, if I've sent the question in with only a day or two. I think we do have to respect the staff's time, and they have other things to attend to. And so our questions are things they'll get to. But if we give them 5 days notice, I do think that's enough time, and it's a reasonable expectation that most of the questions could be addressed at the next meeting.
And I think, you know, I do, you know, think as we're thinking about how we want to adjust things, one of the things that I think is important is that, you know, if you're asking the question, that it's because, you know, you're thinking, oh, this is something that I want to know, but it also might be something that the community wants to know. So when we get the answer, even if the answer satisfies us, I think that we should have some way of reiterating to the community, this is what was asked and this is what was answered. So, you know, kind of maybe getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I also see sort of a like a summary of questions portions of a board meeting where we can do that so that, you know, we can show the community sort of behind the scenes what's going on, because I think that's important too.
Or you could just re-ask the question in the meeting.
Well, so, and I
Well, that's
think
what-
that's, yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Well, I'm saying that re-asking,
Yeah.
I mean, if that's how you'd want to do it, but I think that a quicker, more efficient way of doing it, and I guess we could ask, you know, do you want this re-asked at the meeting, or do you want to re-ask this at the meeting, or are you okay with the summation of the explanation? But just to save time, you know, I think the most efficient way to do it would be just to have like, these questions were asked, these were the answers.
I
Well,
think there's,
Except
sorry.
that sometimes the questions that we ask prior to a meeting inform the presentation that is made. And so like that, well, I included this slide because Katie asked this question.
Yeah, I agree with that. That sometimes
Yes.
you're going to change the presentation, but then sometimes just ask the question when it's in the context so that the community understands the context of the question. I mean, for instance, I sent in a bunch of questions about tonight's meeting late because I didn't really know about all the personnel changes, but I'm giving, you know, in this case, Dr. Jameson, the heads up that, you know, I may be asking these questions tonight. And it gives her at least some time to respond to them.
So I'd like to add, I think there's different kinds of questions, right? Like there's informational questions where you're just trying to clarify a point before a meeting so you understand it, right? And like, you know, I can see, especially for new people, where you might have like 30 questions, which is why I think it's helpful then maybe perhaps instead of sending in a list of questions, you sit down with whichever staff person that is and say, these are the general types of things I want to learn about. Can we sit down and talk through them? That to me is a much better use of resources than someone literally answering 30 questions about it. But second is that when we're talking about meetings, I do have some concerns with the particular protocol, which I will address when we talk about changing it. But the idea of sending all your questions in before a meeting, yes, I think we are all adults and intelligent people and can distinguish the idea of like, hey, I'm going to ask a lot of questions about this. This is fair for me to give a heads up to the staff person who's going to have to answer them. Maybe it's not going to be a part of their presentation, but I also feel like when I'm given a presentation that whoever's giving it to me should be able to answer questions about their presentation, and I shouldn't have to send in all the questions I'm going to ask before time, right? So I feel like this is sort of a fluid, like a very undefinable type of thing. And so I'm with you. Like, I think if you ask a question beforehand, like, I personally don't ask my questions to get answers beforehand, unless it's just to inform my own knowledge of like how we do something. I expect really them to be answered at a meeting. And that's to me the point of doing that. So I feel like there's this practice where like questions are asked before and they're answered, but then they're not brought up in a meeting. And so it feels like very not transparent, or that people aren't asking questions when really they are, right? And that's to me dangerously close to conducting business, not in a public.
Well, I think that,
setting.
like what you're saying, and maybe I'm not being clear about what I'm saying. I think that what I envision is just that, yes, during a meeting, people are naturally going to have questions. But I'm saying that if you got an answer that would have satisfied you, that doesn't mean that you don't ask the question or don't have the information there. That's kind of what I was saying, is that, I just want, hey, these are the things that the board was thinking about. These are the answers that are received, and if there's, I'm sure there's a million ways that you could organically implement it, but that is just something I think is important.
I would just say,
Yeah, and I'm not sure that this is the vibe here or not, but we do have a board norm around no surprises at meetings, both that like, in the spirit of being collaborative, we're not trying to do like gotcha sort of things. And so I do think that that's more of the spirit of this, like, if you have questions, it would be good to know in advance. Again, not that that is preventing anyone from having a thought occur to them in a meeting or, and wanting to ask a question there. But it is, I think, in the spirit of having a collegial working relationship across board and administration.
And as long as the administration also understands that, or, everybody understands that, the answer to the question might be, I don't know yet. Let me find out, which is what might happen. And, you can't plan for everything. You can just do the best you can. So I think that, anyway, I think that the important takeaway is that we just want the information, and I think that, making sure that we've got information, that we're able to present it to the community in a way that makes sense with what we're trying to do, and figuring out what that looks like. I think that's something important to look at, like, as we move forward.
have one more scenario.
Oh, sorry, I apologize.
Is this sorry, are we like talking about, I had another comment about board requests for information. Is the next scenario for the next section we're going to talk about?
Feel free to jump in. It's
okay. Sorry. So I had a question about this blind carbon copying process. If I'm reading it correctly, I feel like it seems a little problematic for the sunshine law. So I guess maybe I'm not understanding it, or we maybe need to stop doing it. But the protocol says the intent is to prevent two-way electronic communications by blind carbon copying. And I guess to me, I don't see how blind carbon copying is different than just copying everyone. So are we talking about a scenario where all members are on an email, and then when we respond, you're blind carbon copying some of them?
No, everybody. So for example, we'll use the example of the request of information that I'm working on currently. So when I send that email, the email will be sent to Kat.
Okay.
And all of the board members are on the board members distribution group. I blind copy the board. So the email will go to Kat and me, and then I blind copy the full board. So when Jenny gets ready to respond, you don't respond to the full board. Everyone else starts chiming in. So you still get the information. Everybody gets it. I don't give anybody information.
Got it.
But it just prohibits everyone being able to chime in, which then constitutes
right. That's the meeting. Yeah. So it's still just a one-way communication.
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Last scenario. The superintendent received a text message from a board member at 10:07 p.m. The board member indicated that they wanted to know the outcome of the discipline hearing for their neighbor's son. They indicated that it was urgent and needed a response immediately. Using the board's protocol, how should this scenario be addressed?
Well, I don't think someone should be asking about, I don't know if they're asking about for their neighbor's son. I don't know. I feel like we're getting into some dangerous territory. But if we're talking about communications with the superintendent, I would just like to say that I appreciate this question because I know for myself, I would not text you at 10 o'clock at night, but I may send an email, right? We all work. We may send emails on the weekend, but I don't expect any person to respond within a certain time frame of that weekend request or evening request, right? Like I think it should be within your normal work week. So anyway.
Thank you for
Yeah.
that.
I agree with you, Jenny, on that one. It's respect of an individual and their personal time. Even though if I send her an email or a text, I don't expect you to reply back to me. And I think people need to respect one another boundaries. But when it comes to asking about your neighbor's son, there's still policies that is not for the board to know because that still have to do with personnel issues, confidentiality of a child, what happened. So
Other thoughts?
I think that when you receive that request, I think it's important for you to first say, I appreciate your concern, but that's not really something that I can look into. That's not how this works.
Other thoughts?
I'm unclear on whether or not this board member even should have access to the disciplinary hearing. I'm not sure at what level that hearing is occurring.
It would only occur after there's a disciplinary decision, and that is then appealed to the board as a whole. So more often than not, we are not privy to those things.
Right. So in this case, the board member should know about the disciplinary hearing because they were sitting in the hearing.
In this scenario, it's actually a superintendent hearing that they're asking about because it potentially could get to the board through an appeal.
Well, then I think the superintendent should be delivering the news when they're ready. It's not really a board member's privy.
Right. And also, too, the other thing to remember is that if you are having a communication with a member on something that you could potentially then adjudicate, that creates a conflict. Unfortunately, the way conflicts work for us, it's sort of like the Supreme Court. We police ourselves. I prefer to take the role of, just the mere appearance of impropriety is impropriety, but that's decisions that all of y'all will have to make for yourselves. But just know that that could potentially be a problem. It could also potentially lead to liability, for any number of situations where you could get sued personally. So you should be very careful about what you discuss with community members, especially something regarding sensitive issues like discipline of a child or corrective action of a teacher or whatever.
All right, so here's the protocol for communicating with the superintendent. To your question, Jenny, I usually respond between 24 and 48 hours. I personally do not email members of cabinet, teachers, principals on the weekend, and I don't email or call them after 5 o'clock because I feel like, to your point, that is their time, and I do respect that, and I do believe in practicing self-care. They know it has to be burning down literally in order for me to reach out, and they know that. But here's what it is, it just talks about the boundaries that exist. I think I threw in a curveball because the one that is not included is that this particular one talks about requesting information out of like curiosity. Because to Josh's point, you really can't have that information if the parent chooses to appeal the decision that's made by the superintendent. We haven't had a situation like that, but I thought it was a cool one to throw in. So this kind of concludes our work session for tonight. And we will come, I write down the questions and some of the thoughts. The next steps, just so the board knows, is when I meet with the union or the association, we'll have similar conversations around culture. That information will come back to the board. I'll put a tidbit of information in the next board note regarding some of these items. And then we'll continue this conversation, because I do think that what I did walk away from the feedback from the team is that we have to define what culture means for us as MRH, ensuring that our core values underpin that work, communicating that, and then having a conversation around what does shared accountability look like for our organization, and being clear about who the role is, because to Katie's point, the superintendent cannot improve culture alone. It is a collaborative process, and that is one of the characteristics that was outlined when we began to talk about establishing effective culture organizationally, whether it's in a school district or a company. So this will come back. Thank you guys for your attentiveness and also doing the homework. I know you have jobs that you have, and this is not a paid job, but I do appreciate you indulging and engaging with me in learning tonight. So that's all I got for tonight.
All right, thank you very much. So I'd like to move on to the action items. We have 3.01. Can I get a motion to approve the reorganization minutes?
Motion to approve the reorganization minutes.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
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 All opposed? All right, motion passes. Can someone please bring us into executives, or move to bring us into executive session, please?
I move to take us to executive session.
We have to
Oh, there's a whole thing you got to
read
read.
it. Here, I was pulling it up.
Oh.
I move to enter executive session in accordance with section 610.021, subsections 3, 9, and 13, and section 610.022 of the revised statutes of Missouri on May 2nd, 2024 for the following specific reasons: personnel matters.
Take a second.
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 Okay, can I get a roll call vote, please?
Matz,
Yes.
Mr. Colbert,
Yes.
Ms. Kaufman,
Yes.
Ms. Martinez,
Yes.
Ms. Robinson,
Yes.
Ms. Schmidt,
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes. Okay, I now say we're going to move into executive session. This meeting is concluded at, what time is it? 8:09. And the link to executive session is in your agenda. If everybody got it?
You must be logged in to
Yes.
access executive session.
So, all right, I'll see you there in a minute.